Tanamo or Gokigenya or whatever. I'm Temp. This presentation will have some spoilers. You can see them right here. This is Drowning in Love with Foot Flappers. Foot Flappers is a fall 2016 anime from... one sec, let me get my notes up. This presentation will be part analysis and part speculation. I'll admit that I'm not exactly the most well-versed person in subjects including Japanese classical literature, 2D animation, and a wide array of other subjects that will be covered. This is the end result of a lot of research and a lot of discussion and dialogue across the internet and the r/2anime Discord. If you notice any errors or if I say anything like flagrantly incorrect about some of the text that I've read, I'll admit that I somewhat skimmed some of the works that that I'm going to cover, but I think I captured the gist and the idea of them. I'm going to be presenting an alternative interpretation to the fall 2016 anime Flip Flappers. And I just want to make it clear right now that a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be very overreaching and sound kind of ridiculous, especially if you've seen, well, I mean, if you've seen the show before. This is going to be somewhat conjecture towards the intent of Kiyotaka Oshiyama and the rest of the creative team at Studio 3Hz. So it's your prerogative to judge what you believe is true and what you think is in fact just pure illusion. Okay, so let's get started. This presentation will become... Oh wait, did I get to the third part? Let me just go ahead and say that I kind of slept through an alarm, and as a result, I had about a quarter of the time I wanted to complete this presentation. But here we go. Part 1, Drowning in Love. So when the second episode of Flip Flappers aired, it was suggested online on A that the painting that both Kokohana Kokomine and Iraha Iridori look at and reference to is a reference to John Everett Millais' Ophelia. And the interesting thing is there's not enough detail actually in this image itself to really come to that conclusion. There's some allusions, like some visual metaphors that people would associate with, especially with how Japan has thought of the Ophelia painting in the past. But it wasn't really until the last episode we actually received a re-showing of that exact same frame intradiegetically or diegetically, such that that we could really understand what was going on in that image and what really it was alluding to, and what really cemented the fact that it was, in fact, an allusion towards John Everett Millais' Ophelia. Now, for those of you whose last memory of Shakespeare was in high school, or as I learned recently, some of you didn't read Hamlet in high school, Ophelia is the tragic love to Hamlet's eponymous protagonist. Throughout the course of the play, she's driven to hysteria at the impetus of heartbreak caused by the knowledge she had exacerbated Hamlet's madness by lying to and deceiving him. This deception plays a role in her father's accidental death at Hamlet's hands, pushing her over the brink into taking her own life, drowning herself in a nearby brink. Now, the idea of drowning is going to become somewhat recurrent here, but before that, let's talk about several parallels. First of all, Ophelia in most stage performances is most commonly depicted as wearing a white dress and being adorned with wildflowers, as we often see Mimi is in the show itself. In Ophelia's perhaps most memorable scene before her death, she offers various flowers symbolically to the rest of the cast of the play. I'm not going to be reciting the lines here, but what she does do is offer flowers that represent sort of I guess what she saw, or what her character saw as the character growth necessary for that character. For one example, she offers rue, which is a symbol for regret and a common abortifacient at the time to Hamlet's mother and to herself. Some people say that this is an expression of her regret towards what happened in the past. And Flip Flappers doesn't really have any cases of flowers being passed around whatsoever. So we'll move forward to the next point. So, and the interesting thing, and the sort of the culmination of her character in Hamlet is that as a consequence of her heartbreak, right, and as a consequence of her madness, she drowns. And the interesting thing to note is that in its portrayal in the story, it isn't explicitly stated that Ophelia necessarily drowned herself or committed the act of suicide. They say she was incapable of her own distress and that it was simply just an accident. The implicit understanding, however, is that what truly happened behind the text of Hamlet itself is that while it may look like an accident or while it may look like something kinder, what really was going on was that Ophelia herself was taking her own life. So this painting right here, this image right here, is the painting of this is John Everett Malais's Ophelia. This was painted in 1852. In my next image, this is the similar shot in the last episode of the finale of Flip Flappers. And right here, I have also included an image of, what was it called? Ophelia from 1883 by Alexandre Cabanel. So the interesting thing I want to note is that Malais's painting of Ophelia actually has a bit of an interesting point of significance in Japanese history. In sort of the earliest 20th century, a highly prolific Japanese author named Natsume Soseki, who you may know for writing Kokoro in 1914. This is in fact considered the most best-selling novel in Japan, and was later adapted actually in the 2009 anime series Aibungaku. But Soseki himself actually wrote a book called Kusamakura, and in Kusamakura, he actually alludes to Ophelia's painting, and as a result, it developed somewhat of a cult following, due to how it's revered in the book itself. So Kusamakura is a bit of an interesting story because it tells the story of an artist attempting to escape the real world and embed himself into the world of art by holding himself up in a remote hotel in a vividly portrayed, desolate, remote environment. And most importantly, he includes the likeness of his alluring, enigmatic hostess, who he describes as being sort of akin to Malais's Ophelia. Kusamakura has a lot of very interesting For example, Soseki expresses a deep amount of regret towards the act of suicide in sort of all of his works. And at least in a good number of his works. In Kusamakura, he actually includes an apology to one of his students named Misa Fujimura, who had earlier committed suicide about 3 years earlier at the age of 16. And he was one of his students, and he's most well known for his death poem, which is the poem he wrote coupled with his suicide. There's also several other interesting allusions to drowning in Kusamakura. Let me just. All right. This one. Wait a second. Yes, I walked down to Mirror Pool and back. I'd like to go there sometime. Please do. Is it a good place to paint? It's a good place to drown yourself. I don't have any intention of doing that just yet. I may do it quite soon. This joke is uncomfortably close to the bone for mere feminine banter, and I quickly glance at her face. She looks disconcertingly determined. Please paint a beautiful picture of me floating there, not lying there suffering, but drifting peacefully off to the other world. Oh shit. Sorry, I did not organize this properly. Another one of Natsume Soseki's most notable works is 10 Nights of Dreams, which he wrote in 1908. In 10 Nights of Dreams, you'll actually be surprised to find that that what happened is actually 10 Nights of Dreams is actually literally referenced in the work in Flip Flappers itself. Not only is it showcased visually in the opening, but it's also the text that she reads from in the, I believe, the second episode. The excerpt Coconut reads from in the story tells the story of a man in a dream, trapped on a ship with nobody he knows, bearing in some direction he doesn't know, or at least he can't figure out. Disheartened and forlorn, he throws himself off the ship, but just after committing to his plummet, he is suddenly forced to confront an intense feeling of fear and regret, now realizing he would have preferred to stay on the ship. Wait a second. As my feet left the deck, it was exactly in the moment I lost contact to the ship. In this moment, life seemed so precious to me. I regret what I did, but it was too late. This would be a lot more impressive if I actually had this coordinated a little bit better. Parallels to the story between these ideas and Flip Flappers itself extend beyond just beyond Soseki's work. And going back to Hamlet, there also includes several ideas over the loss of a father character, representations of insanity and regret, a broken yet mutual love, and implications of having a child in sort of love that's trapped and torn by circumstance. So what I'd like to do, these are two images for Soseki's inclusion in 10 Nights of Dreams. I'd like to do is, and I'd like to propose, is the idea that I think it is almost undeniable, the idea that Mimi committed suicide, that she took her own life. I think there is almost, based on all of the references and the allusions towards her character, as well as several statements by her own character. For example, if we take one of the scenes at the last episode where she says sort of farewell. Well, in the show's finale, when Mimi's two personalities merge back together and agree to return when she was younger, and Dr. Salt rejects a similar offer to go back and change the past, instead electing to exit Pure Illusion, Mimi offers to send the two girls, Coconut and Papika, back home, implying that the world separate from Pure Illusion is where the girls belong and that Mimi herself belongs, in Pure Illusion. This isn't really explained anywhere diegetically in the show itself, but so as a result, we're kind of left with a space where we kind of have to fill it with an interpretive sort of whole. And as it turns out, Death fits in extremely nicely. And we can see in how she expresses her sadness, or while we see her crying in the last episode, that perhaps there's a little bit more to what's going on. And this isn't just the same kind farewell. Also, there's a literal line where Dr. Salt says, "You came back to life in the form of your daughter." So I think it is undeniable that Mimi has passed away. So what happens is this really begs. So let me just say it clear: Mimi's dead. Let's just get that out there. She is dead. Okay. But this begs the question: if she's dead, what exactly is pure illusion, and what is the pure illusion that's referenced in the text of the work? When she is portrayed as in the story prior to the events of Flip Flappers, we see that. We see her exit to pure illusion as a way of fleeing her, as a way for her to flee escaping. But what exactly is pure illusion? In order to come to an idea of what exactly that is, we're going to need to take a bit of a detour. from this scene where she flees her escape, and this is sort of the parting moment of sort of the prequel to Flip Flappers. We're going to need to take a bit of a detour to the subject, to the next part of this story, which is salt in your wounds. Okay, so there was an interview with the chief animation director, Takashi Kojima, for Flip Flappers, posted on A long time ago when the show was airing, and it was roughly translated as saying the following. Did the director give you any advice for the main characters? Yes, he told me, make Toto's pants as short as possible. Seems like he liked Clamp's pretty boys. At first he wore shorts, but they kept getting shorter and shorter. Also, he told me salt was like Osamu Dazai, so draw an ikemen Osamu Dazai. Osamu Dazai is another prolific Japanese writer from the first half of the 20th century. One of his first works, No Longer Human, is widely considered a masterpiece, and second to Soseki's work, was the second best-selling novel in Japan behind, like I said, Soseki's Kokoro. By the way, both of these received an adaptation in Aoi Bungaku, so if you're interested in sort of seeing a summarized capture of these Japanese classics, feel free to watch that. He also wrote the short story Hashire Melos, or Run Melos, which is widely read in Japanese schools and also received 2 anime film adaptations. He's also well known as a character in Bungo Stray Dogs, a manga with a subsequent anime adaptation from 2012 and 2016, respectively. You may also be familiar with Osamu Dazai for the circumstances around his death. In 1948, he committed double suicide by drowning with his mistress, Tomie Yamazaki, in the Tamagawa Aqueduct, the same year he would write his best-selling work. This would not be, of course, his first suicide attempt after failing to hang himself in 1935 and several other attempts. Dazai's character was, as you remember, a big influence for Oshiyama in the work of Flip Flappers, and I think that ignoring his death would be a grave mistake. By the way, here's the character design of Dr. Salt in comparison. So Dazai's work run very much in parallel, both in period and in time period and material, to the work of Albert Camus. Dazai writes stories about disenfranchised, alienated, and dysfunctional people, often questioning the right and desire to die, as well as detaching themselves from society, their suffering and reality. Dazai, in retrospect, seemed to write much of himself into his work, in contrast to Camus, developing a reputation for being a major contributor to the rise of a form of novel called Watakushi Shosetsu, or the I novel, or a book, or the type of book. Writing a book sort of like about a very interpersonal, sort of very intimate sort of look into a character. So his most notable book, okay, moving quickly, No Longer Human, chronicles the life of a man named Oba Yozo, a tormented, paranoid man who struggles to open up and connect with others and resorts to building somewhat of a facade of a personality, choosing to appear as cheerful, pleasant, and comical outwardly, but internally much more resentful and cynical. This develops until he has sort of 2 selves, a superficial self and a self that holds all of his anguish. In college, he ends up pursuing art by association, a medium where he finds that he can similarly render pleasant paintings to show others, but also paintings that are weird and strange, ghostly, private images as an outlet for his own despondency. Disregarding his studies at college and entering a life of debauchery, Yozo's fall culminates in a one-night stand with a married woman with whom he attempts to commit double suicide by drowning with. However, only Yozo himself survives. Yozo's life weaves back and forth as he succeeds and fails to come to terms with his vices, eventually leaving his wife where she is sexually assaulted and confining himself to a mental institution, where upon release, he elects to live far away from others in isolation. The story of The Setting Sun shares many, many themes to the struggles that Kokona herself, as well as Mimi, encounter throughout the course of the story. The image that you're seeing here is, I took a bit of a creative liberty here, but the image on the right here is from the Aoi Bunkaku adaptation of No Longer Human, from the shot of the double suicide. There's an amusing scene where Papika and Kokona, as well as Dr. Salt, all sort of are tossed into the lake outside of the facility that they're at. But we'll return to these ideas later. Dazai's second most famous work is likely The Setting Sun, which he published in 1947, which is the year before his death. And it tells the story of a girl named Kazuko, the daughter of an aristocratic family that struggles to find its place and maintain its wealthy, sort of superficial image in a post-war Japan after the death of the father of the household. Her mother, who slowly succumbs to sickness, dies of tuberculosis. Her brother, after failing to several addictions and frustrated by how hypocritical and dishonest other people are, commits suicide. After a failed marriage, Kazuko embraces the character of a deserted woman, choosing to push back the old traditional morality and raise her own child on her own. The most recognizable symbol, though, and the title of the first chapter of The Setting Sun is The Black Snake, which the mother accidentally mistakes for a thin black cord next to the father's deathbed. Snakes make numerous appearances, actually, throughout The Setting Sun, in the form of eggs, casual references, and as well as several straightforward appearances, just appearing on the side of the road, eventually forming a symbol for the deaths in the characters in the protagonist's family and for the corrupt, deceptive side to the characters in the book. Here's an excerpt.
せっかくの思考が壊れる。ようやく仙人になりかけたところを誰か来て
It occurred to me that mother's face rather unfortunate snake we had just seen, and I had a feeling, for whatever reason, that the ugly snake dwelling in my breast might one day end by devouring this beautiful, grief-stricken mother snake. Now in Flip Flappers, there is a snake, and the illusions and the themes that carry along with it are, in fact, almost exactly the same as to what they are in Flip Flappers, in The Setting Sun. The allusions to classical Japanese literature also extends beyond just the ones I just mentioned. For example, in both The No Longer Human, The Setting Sun, and Flip Flappers, we encounter characters who struggle to come to terms with the difficulties and deceptiveness of those who they face in the world. Right? Kokona, who is distrustful and cynical, is quick to accuse others of deceit. Mimi, when faced with the possibility of losing her child, forms two personas, potentially even taking her own life. Salt, at the loss of his wife, is incapable of facing his daughter as the father he is, and beyond just the parallels to Ava. At no point in the show it's worth noting that at no point does Kokona actually acknowledge Salt as her father, be it that she never learns or she chooses not to. Another idea is the notions of two sides to sort of the same coin, which is something that's not exclusively found in just Mimi. Toto and Yuyu are twins that play a single role throughout the entire series. In Iroha and Irodori's Pure Illusion, Kokona and Papika take the place of a single person, switching places and behavior, one with the aunt and one at home. And throughout the course of the entire series, Kokona and Papika are depicted in visual symmetry in almost innumerable amount of times. In both Sosaki's Kusamaka and Dazai's No Longer Human, we encounter the subject of embedding oneself into their art. In Kusamakura, the protagonist recluses himself entirely into the world of an aesthete, using his dreamlike, idyllic environment as a platform to discover and channel not only his own beliefs towards art, but also himself. In No Longer Human, Yozo does the same as an outlet for his own sort of frustrations with his environment. One last story. Did I make a slide for this? Yes, I did. Oh man, one last story I'd like to talk about Dazai's is his Sanj, or Fallen Flowers, which he wrote in 1944. It's a wartime story that contrasts the heroic death of a soldier in battle and the quiet death of a sick friend at home, and sort of tries to portray them not without one being sort of inherently better than the other. Tries to match them equally. It's very hard to find a translation for this work. But what's actually the most interesting thing about Sanj is its original name, Gyokusai. Intended to use the title Shattered Jewels, Gyokusai, I wrote it down on my copy paper, but it's such a very beautiful expression, I began to feel that it would be too good for the title of my poor story. I erased the characters for Shattered Jewels and changed the titles to Fallen Flowers, Sanj. Quote attributed to Dazai himself in Entering History Through Weak Prose, Dazai Osamu's son, Yukiko Shigeto. Did I make a slide? Did not. Okay. So what's the incredible idea here is that Gyokusai is a term that was used during World War II by the Imperial Japanese army for the act of taking one's own life when faced with capture, describing that, the act of committing suicide, like that of a brilliant gem breaking up into many fragments and shards. As you may already know, Flip Flappers, when Mimi escapes to pure illusion for her final time, she breaks up into a wide variety of fragments. And okay, we're moving on. So quickly, the last section. Oh shit. Anyway, the key idea here is that Flip Flappers tells the story of a. What I'm posing is that perhaps rather than telling the story of, well, let's just put it this way. In order to really know what Flip Flappers is about, I guess you'll need to capture another presentation or the next presentation I'll have on the subject, because there's a lot more themes and ideas in Flip Flappers that continue to extend beyond the content of what I was able to capture. But I'd like to leave it on one interesting note, which is the last line of the show itself. At the very end of the show, we see Coconut and Paprika fleeing, or not fleeing, but returning back to their original reality. And we see her father, we see Dr. Salt smiling, we see Yayaka all happy again, we see sort of everything return to normalcy. But in the background, there's a song singing, and the last line of this track and the last line of Flip Flappers itself before the ending is this: "The world we see is an illusion." As everything is returned back to normalcy, we finally see that we're behind the text, and in the audio in the background, we finally hear an allusion to perhaps not everything in this original world is what it seems. Thank you. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get to everything. I actually didn't even get to the actual interpretation itself, but at least this gives you some context and background about about perhaps another way of seeing Flip Flappers. I am literally 2 minutes away. I cut into my Q&A time, so 2 minutes of questions and answers. Go. Anybody?
Can you just give us the spark notes of what the conclusion is?
Well, what I was going to do in the conclusion was to effectively show that the story of Flip Flappers is not the story of a girl who is pulled into a fantasy adventure, but rather the story of a girl introspectively coming to terms with and struggling with a disorder like schizophrenia. And really what Pure Illusion is not actually this fantasy environment, but rather her own delusion and her struggle to reconcile the history with her mother and her abandonment by both her father and the death of her mother. There is a lot of in-text evidence for this, but unfortunately, no time. Should have planned it out a little bit better. Any other questions?
Thanks.
I have a question, which is based on that conclusion. Given that Paprika is obviously an allusion to Paprika and Satoshi Kon, and this series Flip Flappers in general seems to be about that same sort of diegetic, interdiegetic sort of stuff that Satoshi Kon dealt with. Do you think that maybe this series points to more of a discussion about literature and narrative itself instead of maybe the more character-focused interpretation that you were thinking of with the schizophrenia?
I want to say actually no, because in particular because of the last scene, not the last scene, but the scene before the last scene, where we're given a sort of I guess in a way, a fake twist of a real sort of, I guess I'm going to put this in quotes, but a realistic environment where we see Coconut sort of wake up, and the allusions to sort of a lot of the texts that are included throughout the course of Flip Flappers. I want to say that I don't think it does that. No, I think structurally, if you read Oshiyama's interviews, he often talks about how it's the psychology of the characters that drove sort of the design inspirations of the show, and not the larger ideas towards sort of the narrative and I guess larger in scope. I guess Sorry, I can't.
I get you. No, that's great.
copy
That's a perfectly good answer. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? If not, then we'll have, I think we're going to cut break a little bit shorter and have if that's all right. Yeah, this should be all right. Cut it a little bit shorter and we'll have a 20-minute break. Feel free to get some snacks, get a drink, or if you want, we can just chat here. I'll be here. If you want any questions from me or any of the other presenters who have gone, maybe they're here or not. It's up to them. Otherwise, the other presenters continue to make last-minute additions like I was doing, and we'll look forward to it. 20, I guess 18 minutes on my clock. It's 5:12 over here.